Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. All right, everybody, thanks for joining us today. Now, Jim, admittedly, you posted a news article recently on churchandculture.org, and for those of you who might be new to the podcast, every day Jim posts like the top headlines that are relevant to church and culture on churchandculture.org. And anyways, there was one that I couldn't resist because it was from the New York Times, and it was called "Weddings That Are Out of This World," or at least way out of the chapel. Now, I've been to a lot of weddings, gosh, certainly not nearly as many as you have, Jim, but I always enjoy seeing the ways that couples add, their own unique flavor or personality to the wedding reception and the ceremony. But lately, it seems like couples aren't just adding, unique touches here or there, but really reinventing them altogether with little to no concern for preserving any type of tradition, more or less Christian tradition. Now, we've talked before on the podcast, and we'll link this in the show notes, about the growing disregard for the sanctity of marriage. But I thought maybe today we could talk about the sanctity of a wedding. So why don't we start off with some cultural and historical background? Like, we know from the book of Genesis that marriage was God's idea, but what about the wedding ceremony? When and why did that come into play?
I would argue the when was creation. There was a bit of a ceremony there, I would argue. And the why, because of the nature of marriage itself and that God established it as such. In Genesis, it's made clear that marriage between a man and a woman is rooted in creation itself. God brought Eve to the man for the relationship to begin. He walked her down the aisle, if you will. He literally brought her to him, presented her to him. And Adam replied with what you could call the first set of vows. This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And I don't think I'm actually creating a lot of eisegesis there. I think that's really, you can make a case for that. And it says that from then on, and for that reason, men and women will leave their home and they will be united to each other in marriage. That uniting has always been seen as an act, a ceremony, an event of some kind that marks it in their lives and before others and before God. It was always seen as something sacred. In fact, for the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, it's one of the seven sacraments. They have seven sacraments. This is real quick. This is because it's really relevant and pertinent. One of the differences between Protestants and Catholics and the Orthodox are that Catholics and the Orthodox highlight and embrace and designate seven sacraments. They've got baptism. They've got confirmation, which is chrismation in the Orthodox Church. You have Eucharist. You have holy orders. You have penance, anointing of the sick, and then you have marriage. Protestant just have two, baptism and the Lord's Supper, baptism and Eucharist, or sometimes called communion. And I'll tell you, if anyone wanted to argue with me, Catholic friend, an Orthodox friend wanted to argue that marriage should be at least added to our two sacraments so that we should have three, I'd let him win. I would so give in. I would say, you don't even have to push. I probably would tend to agree with you. And I treat it as such, pastorally, to be honest with you, which is why Jesus added that what God has joined together. And there was that sense that the wedding was a holy event that signaled the two being made one by God through the event. Let man not separate. Because it wasn't something of men. It was something of God. Which is why the sacrament, or just sacred nature of weddings, this is why weddings have been officiated by the church, overseen by the church, stewarded by the church. The content of the wedding, the officiant of the wedding, the recognition of the wedding, all was overseen by the church as something sacred and binding. The wedding ceremony, if you will, marriage, belonged to the church as a sacrament and at the very least something sacred. This was from the earliest of recorded history, all through the Bible. Jesus even honored the wedding event by attending weddings and even performed his very first miracle at a wedding. So the wedding ceremony is something that is deeply and firmly established, I would argue, from creation forward, and has been part of the Christian faith and the Christian church from the very beginning.
Now, as I was thinking about this topic, I was reminded so last month, in preparation for Christmas, at the church that you and I serve at, we set up what we called a hall of traditions, in which we displayed some common Christian staples, things like a Christmas tree or a wreath or a candy cane, and we had some signs that explained their significance within Christian history. And I can't tell you the number of times I overheard people remark at just their complete surprise when they realized the deep significance behind each one. So this might sound like an odd question, but if we were to set up, a hypothetical hall of traditions, but applied to a wedding ceremony, what do you think you'd want to include in it?
See, I think that's a great question. And it's not hard to walk through a few. First, you have the symbolism of ceremony itself, of the ceremony. It traditionally begins with the bride entering dressed in white, escorted by her father or whatever male has that kind of protective giving away role in her life. Okay, let's just walk through that. The white speaks to the sexual purity that is meant to be brought to the marriage. That's why it's the tradition. That her virginity has been preserved for her husband, is being presented to her husband as a gift, and she presents herself to him and him alone. The giving away, so that's the symbolism of the white. The symbolism of the father, the giving away of the father, represents how the father approves of the marriage and is passing on the mantle of responsibility to protect and provide from him to her husband. The declaration of consent, who will you have this woman to be your wife, speaks to the nature of the commitment, the public calling out of the nature of the relationship. The vows are so special. When a man and a woman are led to recite their vows publicly, it's not simply to each other or before others. It is before God. They're making a spiritual commitment before him. And throughout scriptures, public vows made to God before others and to God in that kind of setting is a binding thing. And it's a very deeply spiritually significant thing. Such vows as for rich or for poor, in sickness and in health, always end with the line, as God is my witness, I give you my promise. The vow is with God sealing it and doing it before God. The exchange of rings is full of significance, meaning when you wear the ring, you tell the world that you're taken, that you're married. That you are in this relationship. It is a visible, it's a tangible public sign that you have taken those vows. And to not wear it would be sending the opposite signal. I'm available. I'm let's come flirt with me, or something. The ring itself, why a ring? The circle represents, time without end. And it was symbolic of till death do us part. And that's why even the ring and the circle nature of it is that eternal, that time without end, till death. I made this vow till death. The pronouncement at the end of the ceremony is also full of meaning. It's when the church and the pastor of that church, the one charged and appointed, whoever the pastoral figure may be, but the one appointed and authorized and charged by God through the church to perform the wedding, makes it official. And they are the ones that makes it official. They're the one. It's a church thing as an extension of God. It's not simply a blessing. It is a pronouncement. It is affirming that a true wedding in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the church and through the agencies acting on behalf of the church with its authority, a marriage has taken place. This has really taken place and a wedding has taken place that has resulted in marriage. The language is clear, the traditional language at least. I pronounce, as a pastor, I pronounce that they are husband and wife in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, what God has joined together, because all of that is what made it so that God is the one that joined them together. Let man not mess with, not separate. So that's some of the symbolism, some of the meaning of it all, that none of it's throwaway. It's all deeply significant and should be seen as such.
Well, I want to talk more about the role of the church officiant in a wedding ceremony. In that article from the New York Times, the reporter told about a wedding in which the bride and the groom had, and I'm quoting here, a ceremony facilitator. I myself have been to a handful of weddings in which the one marrying the couple was, a friend or a family member who just got ordained online a few days earlier just to, be able to perform the wedding. And for the non-religious, I can see why, having the presence of a Christian clergy would seem inauthentic to them. And yet, I don't know, I kind of wonder if that's the point. Would you want to riff on that a bit?
Ooh, yes. Go ahead and throw me red meat and punch my button. First, let's talk about a wedding event that is not between Christians. Okay, let's just set a baseline here. And let's go further. Let's say it's not a religious wedding at all of any kind, because a Muslim wedding or a Hindu wedding isn't a Christian wedding, but it's deeply spiritual with lots of religious overtones. So let's imagine one that's not trying to be spiritual at all. Okay? If that's the case, the wedding, if you will, is simply a party taking note of a civil union. That's all it is. And they would and should feel free to work it any way they want that fulfills whatever legal requirements that they may have civilly for a marriage, and then throw whatever kind of party or ceremony that they want. There's no, which of course does not take a wedding at all. I mean, you don't even have to have a wedding, just the fulfillment of the legal requirements for marriage. Here in North Carolina, it changes a little bit from place to place. But here in North Carolina, in the United States, the marriage ceremony must be conducted by a recognized officiant, an officiant that the state recognizes. Both parties must solemnly declare their intent to marry. Following the ceremony, at least 2 witnesses are required to sign the marriage license, and you have to have a marriage license, which can be secured from a Register of Deeds office. There doesn't have to be any religious component whatsoever. It can just be this short, sweet civil ceremony before a civic official, judge, anyone who is recognized by the state. Now, let's say you have Christians marrying, or one of them is a Christian. Let's say they want it to be a religious ceremony or a spiritual one in nature with Christian overtones and symbolism and verbiage. For them to go outside of the church and its umbrella of meaning and authority, presence and community, accountability and support would separate it from its sacred and sacramental nature. It would. To bring in a friend or family member instead of a member of the church's ordained pastoral team would be removing it from the way a Christian wedding is meant to be conducted. And for someone to get a mail order ordination to perform the wedding as if they are a member of the clergy under the authority of the church makes a mockery of the church, makes a mockery of ordination. It makes a mockery of the calling of God on a life to enter into ministry. It's a mockery of the sacrament of ordination and more. It should be repugnant to any Christian. I'm not saying they meant to do this. People today are so undiscipled, have such a weak view of the church. They are so outside of the church, many times even as Christians, they don't know better. Even as professing Christians, they don't know better. But that's why we're talking about it here. And even if I say that and it steps on some toes of some people who consider themselves Christians who did that, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. They just and chalk it up to ignorance. But let's clear up the ignorance. Let's do that. There are so many ways for friends and family to play a part in a wedding without doing that. It's really unnecessary. And let me chase something here. There's a bit of a slippery slope going on with weddings, and specifically Christians and weddings. Think about just the progression that has been made, even in my lifetime, and which actually I'm old enough that I should say even in the last 10 years, because there's been a heck of a lot more than just that. First, we felt the freedom increasingly to go away from the symbolism, go away from wearing rings, go away from wearing white and what they represent. Then we felt the freedom to start writing our own vows instead of embracing and submitting to the vows that have historically marked Christian marriage for centuries. Then we felt the freedom to move to venues outside of a church, a barn, a beach. Then we felt the freedom to pick whoever we want to marry us, and for it to be free of any type of authorization of the church or under the accountability of the church or the authority of the church. Just I'll have my friend or brother-in-law do something and I'll do that. Now, things like whether you get married in a church or a barn are not critical to my thinking. However, many of the other things are. Here's the big shift when I've seen when it comes to weddings. And I think this is, I want to say this carefully because I think this is deep waters. Instead of the couple submitting to the wedding ceremony, they want the ceremony to submit to them. It's all about them. They want to write it. They want to direct it. They want to mold it. They want to shape it in any and every way, because in their minds, it's all about them and it's all for them. But it's not all about them. It's not. It's about God. It's about the community of faith of which they are a part, the church. It's about something sacred, if not a sacrament. The wedding doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the church because it belongs to God. It is something to be governed, officiated, vetted, approved, affirmed, and sanctioned. It is something facilitated for you as a Christ follower by the authority God has established through the local church. You don't dictate to it. It dictates to you. You don't write your vows, you submit to the vows that are there historically and biblically, and on it goes. You don't pick who marries you. You are married by the church and that authority. And it's you don't go to them and say, here's what I need you to do. It's like, no, we're going to tell you what this wedding needs to do and what it needs to be for you. Yes, there's some places where there's creativity and we're going to personalize it and all that, but you're submitting to a Christian wedding, which means there are some things you have no say-so over if we're going to do it, And again, this slide shouldn't surprise us because culturally, marriage has been in a slide. We've made marriage anything we want. And, divorce and remarry is at will for any and every reason. And the devaluation of marriage and even redefining who we can marry and same-sex marriage and so many other things. And we've made it less and less and less, far and farther away from holy matrimony and more about just what is self-fulfilling for me and something that is just going to fulfill legal, civil checkboxes. And, and it's completely been ripped aside from any of its Christian moorings and taken outside of the church. When that is what non-Christians do, that's one thing. When people say, doesn't it upset you that these people are able to get married legally? Well, that's not even marriage to me. It's a civil thing. I mean, yes, I have obvious opinions on it, but when you're talking about Christian marriage, you're talking about holy matrimony, and that's something that's very countercultural right now in our moment.
So not something you feel really strongly about?
Not a bit. Not a bit.
Well, it was interesting how you mentioned that, a marriage ceremony between two non-Christians. I mean, they wouldn't feel obligated to have, religious or spiritual elements to it. And yet we're not finding that that's the case. We're finding that more and more couples are wanting to incorporate spiritual elements into their ceremony, even again, if they're not Christian elements. In that New York Times article, there was mention of wedding cakes that represented, Kundalini energy and chakras. There was a harpist who was playing medicine music.
Mhm.
The bride and the groom, they opted to be barefoot in order to be one with the earth. And the reporter also mentioned the rise in popularity of couples using numerologists to determine the best wedding date. In other words, even for those who don't believe in a Christian God, a wedding still seems to invoke a desire for the divine. What are your thoughts on that?
Not surprised at all, because we are incurably religious, you know, and it shows how incurably religious and spiritual that we are. That even when there is a wholesale rejection of religion and specifically Christianity, there is still the hunger, there's still the desire, the need. Reminds me of what the French philosopher and mathematician Pascal called the God-shaped hole or vacuum that exists in every human being. And we try to fill that void or hole with so many things, but we never quite succeed because it's God-shaped. He put it there, and it can only be filled by him. But you still see people very much, obviously, they're keenly aware of that God-shaped hole, and how, again, incurably religious we are. C.S. Lewis actually did quite a bit of building off of this in his great apologetic in Mere Christianity, where he was saying, so if we really are a purely naturalistic view of the world, I'm paraphrasing him here, if we have a purely naturalistic view of the world, why do we have this spiritual hunger? If we just evolved from a pool of primordial slime? And you can say, well, like Freud said, well, it's our desire for it, Yeah, but you would think that as our world gets increasingly secular, that desire would go away. And so there really isn't an explanation for it. You could say, well, we got a God gene. That was a big thing several years ago. There's a gene, something in us. Well, why did that evolve? See, that makes no sense either. We evolved in a naturalistic view, to function, to survive, to exist. And so why would we develop a gene for something that doesn't exist? So yeah, I mean, it begs a lot of questions. But obviously, as Christians, we know exactly why we have it. We were created in the image of God, which means we have a soul and the ability to respond and to relate to the living God. And so, and we have that desire, and our hearts are restless, Augustine said, until they find their rest in thee. And so, to the point of a wedding, it's clearly a reflection of how we were made. We were made, men and women, for marriage, to be joined into one by God. And that's hardwired into creation, which means hardwired into us. It's part of that God-shaped whole. So when two come together to be married, even if it's anything but holy matrimony, there is an innate desire often for it to feel spiritual, feel soulish.
Yeah. All right. Let me ask you a direct question. You've already hinted at this before, but just in case there's anybody who's listening and they're planning a wedding, or if that's in their near future, what must be present in a wedding for it to be considered a Christian ceremony? So one that would honor the holiness of marriage.
I'm really glad you're asking these questions, because this is just not being talked about with clarity or with courage, quite frankly. There are several things that have to be present if it is going to be a Christian wedding. One that honors God and can be affirmed and officiated by the church and honors the sacramental nature of the event. First, both need to be followers of Jesus. Authentic, true followers of Jesus, both. If both, not just one of them, if both are not Christians, I cannot marry them, because it's not a God-honoring marriage, nor is it a Christian wedding, because you're already violating the one of the main dictates that was given about marriage, is that you shouldn't be unequally yoked. You shouldn't marry outside of your faith. I mean, the two can't become one. And you've heard me teach on this extensively. It would be a violation of the sacrament. It really would be a violation of it. It'd be like taking the Lord's Supper wrongly, or baptizing someone who shouldn't be baptized. It falls into that category. It wouldn't and couldn't be two becoming one. It wouldn't be a wedding that would honor God or invite God, because you're beginning by rebelling against God and treating it wrongly. The Bible teaches that we're free to marry whoever we want as long as they're a fellow believer. So that's first. Second, the marriage must be approved and affirmed by the church of which they are a part and they are under. The reason I say that is because there are scenarios when two people say that they are, well, first of all, because it is something that is entrusted to the church. I mean, and so it's always fallen under the church and the authority of the church. It's something stewarded by the church. But there are scenarios when two people say they're Christians, come to be married, and the church may not be able to approve or affirm the relationship biblically, even though they're Christians or say they are. For example, one or both are wrongfully divorced, and to remarry would be committing adultery. The church can't enable or affirm that. Another example might be that the couple are already living together and show that they have little respect as a result for the institution of marriage, and they have absolutely no desire, no intent on ending their very open embrace of premarital sex and even living together. And yet they're coming somehow to have this holy event that they've already shown disdain for in terms of their relationship. That would need to be addressed before moving forward. I'm not saying it can't be addressed. I'm saying it has to be addressed. It may be a wedding that is outside of God's design for marriage, such as a same-sex union. So it needs to be approved and affirmed by the church. Third, it needs to take place under the umbrella of the authority of the church, meaning whoever officiates has been set aside and designated for that role and function by the church. For example, let's just let me just give the Lord's Supper as an example. A group of Christians just can't take it upon themselves to just go ahead and, well, let's just celebrate the Lord's Supper. Now that's a sacrament stewarded by the church. And not every event of the Lord's Supper has to be supervised by me, but it has to be supervised by a pastor or someone that's been officially set aside by the church to oversee such things. And we can set aside, for example, let's just say there's a special event that's happening as a group of people are wanting to take the Lord's Supper as a part of the church, an extension of the church. And, it can be authorized, but it needs to be authorized. The Lord's Supper does not belong to the Christian, it belongs to the church who stewards it. So that also means that the content of the wedding, the elements, the symbols, the verbiage have met the approval of the church. Because it's not their ceremony, it's the church's ceremony. It's what we've approved is going to be an appropriate ceremony. So everything from music to the vows has been cleared. Finally, it has to be public in nature. There are vows said to each other before God and before others. That has always been part of the nature of a Christian wedding. It is public in the way that baptism is public. It's meant to be that. Baptism is when you go public with your relationship with Christ. A wedding is when you go public with your commitment, your relationship, your marriage to your spouse. You aren't allowed to go public with baptism any way you want. That's a sacrament of the church. You can't self-baptize. You can't have the meaning of that baptism be whatever you want it to be. You submit to baptism. Baptism does not submit to you. It's no different when it comes to the public nature of a Christian wedding. There are certain elements that need to be present if it's going to be a Christian wedding, and it needs to be protected.
In addition to what you just mentioned, just talking to someone who has performed a lot of weddings, my own included, where would you
had a beautiful wedding.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad I checked off all these boxes since you agreed
Well,
to be
I'm the one that married you. I was your pastor. So yeah, you I didn't give you a choice, but those boxes.
Okay, so where would you or have you needed to draw the line when it comes to participating in a wedding? Like is there a point where a couple can add so many, unique additions or edits to the ceremony to the point that it would push it into a category in which you could no longer participate?
Yeah. I'll just give you some from experience. I can tell you the kinds of things that I've had to talk with couples about and we've had to fix or address. First, the introduction of non-Christian or even anti-Christian elements or symbols. Like they'll be fine with everything, but they want to bring this in or add this to it. For example, you have two Christians marrying, but one of them has Hindu parents who want to have something in the ceremony that tips its hat to Hinduism, some symbol, some Hindu prayer, something like that. a Christian wedding is a Christian wedding, and introducing pagan elements or occultic elements, prayers to a Hindu god, for example, or something like that, would be an abomination and a clear affront to God. So, second, I learned the hard way when I first started officiating weddings as a young buck in my 20s that you need to screen the music and not just have music slots where you say, okay, here's the ceremony. We're going to be following the traditional Christian wedding ceremony, but you can have music here and you have music there, and you pick what you want, but here are your kind of slots, if you will, or you better know, you got to find out what that slot filling is. I'll never forget one couple, literally, they wanted Rod Stewart's "Do You Think I'm Sexy" for her entrance music. That just wasn't exactly felt particularly Jesus-y to me at that moment. And fortunately, I found that one out in time. All to say, music can dishonor the sacred nature of the event or trivialize it. It's not just a matter of subjective taste. It's be a cheapening of it. Almost, A third thing that comes to mind are non-biblical vows. Couples writing their own vows is very common these days. That's kind of a new thing. But if they are offered on top of the traditional Christian vows, you've actually led them through the vows that really biblically, traditionally should be made publicly before others and to each other and before God. Adding vows that you write are fine. That's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But I want to see them. I want to see them. You need to have them write them out, and you need to know what they're going to say before they say it, because these vows, is part of this public Christian event, ceremony, very sacred. And someone can say something in their vows, well-intentioned or not, that's just a hot mess, biblically and theologically crazy, completely wrong, or takes a shot at somebody, or there's all kinds of stuff, these vows can even in some ways undermine, if not refute, the biblical vows they just took. So that is one. Finally, and we've talked about this, if you were to introduce or want to use other officiants or elements that are not Christian, like a dual wedding where one officiant is a Christian and the other is a imam or something. But again, doubtful that you would reach that stage, because that would be a sign that you don't have two Christians marrying. But the bottom line is that, and I say this unashamedly, I am a Christian pastor leading a Christian church that holds to biblical orthodoxy. I can only do Christian weddings that meet the biblical criteria for a God-honoring wedding. All of MEC's pastors, any wedding under the umbrella of MEC, Mecklenburg Community Church, the church that I lead, any wedding that falls under our umbrella that we are associated with in any way must meet the biblical criteria for a God-honoring wedding. It must be a Christian wedding, one that we approve and do. And that's one of the reasons why we just don't do weddings. We only marry members. And let me just add this: I'm not in the wedding business. I'm in the people business, the soul formation business. I'm in the pastoring, shepherding business, the leading of a Christian community business. Weddings are part of that to a degree, but we're not about some legal transaction or civil union, but holy matrimony. And that means, doggone it, keeping it holy. And so that's the intent.
Yeah. I feel like a broken record at the end of every podcast. I'm like, man, that was so helpful. This was so helpful. I think this is going to be a highly shared podcast episode, because I know so many young couples I'd love to get this to. But thank you. Like you said before, this is not something that's talked about enough. Thankfully, I think my husband and I honored the spirit of this in our own wedding, but I just wish I would have been able to hear something like this and to really have learned more about the symbolism and the significance. And yeah, there's just so much here. So thank you, Jim. Thank you guys for listening. We hope you'll join us again next week.